In our next conversation, I forgot what we're going to talk about. Welcome to Gospel Tangents, the best source for Mormon history, science, and theology. I'm Rick Bennett. The Book of Mormon ends with a gigantic battle in which millions of people were killed. Critics say that there are no bones found near the Hill Cumorah, so it couldn't be the site where all those people were killed. We're going to talk about that issue with Jonathan Neville. Does he think that's a big issue? Check out our conversation.
But the other thing is, when Moroni first came to Joseph Smith, and people don't even know this, it's right in the history. He told Joseph Smith that the record was written and deposited not far from his house. So if it was written and deposited not far from Joseph's house, then he said it was written not far from your house. So where were Moroni when they wrote it? They had to be not far from his house. So I'm going to anticipate a question that you might have. And that is, everybody says, well, there's no evidence of this great battle at Cumorah.
Yeah, that's exactly where I was going.
Okay.
Okay.
This is almost more important than the issue with the snow and volcanoes.
Okay.
And by the way, it's a real clear example of sophistry if someone applies a standard of proof to one thing and not to another, like the snow and the volcano thing. Just to reiterate, they say the Book of Mormon doesn't mention snow, so they couldn't have been in a place where there was snow. It doesn't mention volcanoes, but they had to be where there were volcanoes anyway. That's an inconsistent, that's sophistry, because you're applying different standards. So when it comes to the Hill Cumorah in New York, it's really fascinating, because I think that was the key to interpreting the text. And when you go back and look carefully, first of all, people say there were millions of people killed there, millions of Jaredites killed there, right? That's not what the book says at all. If you look at the book, Reinterpreting talks about 2 million of his people killed. That was years before the final battle at Cumorah. And he also, it's hard to tell from the text what time frame he's referring to. And I did an analysis. If he was only talking about in his own lifetime or over the history of the Jaredites, you can't tell which it was. But even if it was over his lifetime, 2 million people, that worked out to something like 20 or 30,000 a year, which to me is not that plausible, but much more plausible than 2 million, right? But if you look at what Ether wrote about the Jaredite battle, he tells us how many people died on the last 3 days of that week. It was 1 week of battle, and it was like half. So I extrapolated it backwards, and it was less than 10,000 people in the whole Jaredite battle, which makes sense. And Oliver Cowdery in letter 7 said there were thousands of bodies from the Jaredites, which means less than 10,000. And that's what the Book of Mormon text says. So if you realize that the Jaredites were less than 10,000 in their final battle, and also if you remember that Moroni said he was only talking about the people in this north country, he wasn't talking about the entire hemisphere or even about all the Americas or even anywhere outside of this north country where he was living when he wrote this, around New York. Lots of other Jaredite peoples. He was only talking about the ones that in Ether's genealogy that were living in northern New York that were extinguished, and it was less than 10,000. So then you get to the battle of the Nephites and Jaredites, right? And what does Moroni say? Well, Mormon, when he gets to the top of the hill, he said, we beheld my 10,000 and we beheld Moroni's 10,000, right? So then you ask yourself, is 10,000 a number or a military unit? And it's certainly not a number, because otherwise he would have to say 9,998 of mine and 2,000 or 10,003 of Moroni's. It wasn't exactly 10,000. And 10,000 is a common military unit all around the world for people. In fact, even in this book I mentioned the Anabasis, the Greek book everybody studies when they study Greek. By the end of the war, they had less than 6,000 people, but they still called them the 10,000. Because it was like a battalion, is what we would say today. So Mormon would say, I saw my battalion and Moroni's battalion. It tells us nothing of how many people were actually there.
So you don't trust those numbers are literal?
Oh, I don't think they're literal at all. I don't think they could possibly be literal. Because how would you even know if there was exactly 10,000 and not 9,995 in the battle? You have no way of knowing. So it's a military unit. Then he says, and in English this is tricky, because the word behold as kind of an exhortation or learn from this lesson. You say, behold, the gospel's true, let's say. Or behold, and Mormon uses that a lot as, behold, here's a lesson from history. But it's the same word as I beheld something, meaning I saw something. And so it's confusing when you read that part of Mormon chapter 6. But he says, we beheld, past tense, we saw, or we did behold, our 10,000, our 10,000. And he says, and behold, so-and-so and his 10,000 also, right? He lists off, I think, 21 other generals in their 10,000 that had been killed. So people assumed there were 23 units of 10,000 each, 230,000 Nephites. They were at the Hill Cumorah. And that, I lived my whole life with that assumption until I said, wait a minute, I'm going to set aside all these other interpretations and I'm going to say, what does the text actually says? And he only says he saw two groups of 10,000, his and Moroni's. That's it. The others, he says, and behold, so-and-so fell, so-and-so fell, so-and-so fell. He doesn't say he saw them at the Hill Cumorah. And so I started thinking, well, if you read back the chapters, especially from chapter 2 through 5, and he talks about the continual scene of wickedness and all these wars going on, and they're retreating all the way from, I think, Ohio into western New York. And all along the way, they're being wiped out and the city's burned and all these terrible things happening, right? At one point in that narrative, he says they gathered all the people together and they had an army of 42,000. That's after they gathered everybody together. And then the Lamanites had, I think, 44,000, something like that. And the Nephites were able to beat them. That's the largest enumerated army, I think. There might have been 160,000 somewhere else, but that's the largest enumerated army in that part of in Mormon's explanation, was 42,000 people. And that was before the retreat to New York, when they were getting wiped out and fleeing and all this other stuff. So how could they possibly have had 230,000 people at Cumorah when the biggest enumerated army was 42,000? So when I looked at that, I said, okay, here's Mormon at the end of his life. He'd been a general since he was 14 or 15 years old. So I think he was thinking about relating all the people who had died throughout his lifetime while he was their general. He said, behold, this guy died, and this guy died, and then a bunch of them he didn't even name. And so that's how I see it. I see that, okay, 20,000, well, 2 units called 10,000 of Nephites at Cumorah, presumably a few more than that of Lamanites, let's say 30 or 40,000 maybe, because they overwhelmed the Nephites. But there could have only been 5,000 or 6,000 Nephites, or maybe 10,000 total of 2 units, because if you say 10,000 is a unit, not a specific number, it could be any number up to 10,000, right? Or around 10,000. So, and after all this retreat, it could have been like Xenophon's 10,000, they were down to 6,000 people or something. So when I read what Oliver Cowdery said, it was interesting. He said thousands of Jaredites and tens of thousands of bodies, including Nephites and Lamanites, that were there. And they weren't buried, they were just there. So tens of thousands means less than 100,000 combined. And he didn't say how many tens of thousands, but it would have been, in my interpretation, the 2 units of Mormon and Moroni, and then however many Nephites were killed. So it could have been, 15 to 20, 30,000 people total in that mile-wide valley. And if you've been there, that's a huge valley. They can put 10,000 people just in the crowd to watch the pageant, which doesn't even cross the highway. It's a small part of the valley where the Hill Cumorah is. So to have 10 or 20 or 30,000 dead bodies, let's say, in that entire valley, all spread out, you would never have evidence of that, especially because he specified we didn't bury them. They were just left open. So I think, okay, if you think historically, given those assumptions, which is what the text actually says, not what our interpretation is, and what Oliver Cowdery said about it, then you have to say, what are your expectations in terms of archaeology? And you would expect to find, 2,000 years later, you expect to find no bones or anything, for sure. No organic material like, clothing or furs or, skins and any of that stuff. You might expect to find some weapons of war. But in the ensuing, 15 to 1,800 years of Indians going back and forth through there, they don't just leave a hatchet on the ground, they take it, right? So you wouldn't expect to find very many artifacts except for arrowheads, because arrowheads are so plentiful and hard to find and all that. Well, it turns out when Bean went out there, Willard Bean went out there, and he lived out there for 25 years.
The fighting preacher.
Yeah, the fighting preacher with his kids. His kids said that the arrowheads were so commonplace they used them as skipping stones in the ponds. And they also talked about finding skulls that were buried, because the Jaredites we don't know if they didn't bury. But they found skulls that were so big they could put them on their head, and they were like helmets and stuff. And so this is Willard Bean's own kids talking about this. And I've seen accounts. I lived out. One of the reasons I bought a house out there is I wanted to know this stuff for myself, right?
Bought a house in Palmyra.
In Palmyra. It was right up the road from the Hill Cumorah. And I talked with a state archaeologist who is responsible for all the archaeological surveys when they do pipelines and roads and stuff. And I said, how can I find some arrowheads or artifacts? And he asked me where I lived, and I told him, and he said, well, is there a farm to you? And I said, yeah, our backyard borders up to the farm. And he said, if you go out there in the spring when they're plowing, just walk behind the tractor, you'll find arrowheads, because they're everywhere here. Unfortunately, I was never there in the spring, partly because we went to Africa for a year and then China, so I never was able to do that. But I went with him to one site, and he just kind of scrounged around in the dirt and came up with a couple of arrowheads and gave them to me. He said, we have over 1 million artifacts in our archives at University of Buffalo, and we can't even put them on display. They're not even all cataloged. And this place is just full of them. Every farmer here has a bunch of them, including around the Hill Cumorah. So John Clark, who's one of my favorite guys, he's an awesome guy, but he's a total Meso guy, and I don't want to get into, I shouldn't mention his name probably, but he wrote some of the seminal articles on the Hill Cumorah stuff that everybody's been relying on ever since. And one of them I remember in particular, because I really checked it out, and some graduate student, I think from Albany, came out and interviewed farmers on the east and on the north of Cumorah, and they said they'd never dug up any artifacts. And I thought to myself, well, if they had just read letter 7. Oliver Cowdery said that if you stand on top of the Hill Cumorah, a mile west there's a parallel hill. He says it's between these hills, that's why the name of the book is Between These Hills. Between these hills is where this battle took place. That was west of Cumorah, it wasn't east or north. And yet this graduate student went east and north. So he wasn't even looking where he should have been looking. And so John Clark says, well, because of that, there's no archaeology, so it couldn't have been there. And then he cited another paper, which has not been published, but I got it. It was like mimeographed or something from some graduate student out there. But I got it from, I think, off of eBay or somewhere. And I went through it, and I could not believe it. What the student actually said was exactly opposite of what John Clark said he said. And he was talking about when they were doing a survey for a highway, and they uncovered some artifacts and stuff. And I don't have time to get into the detail of it, but I've blogged about it and explained it and shown the quotations and so on. And so even this archaeology from New York told us, he gave us a list of all the Hopewell sites in western New York that they'd found. Because the Hopewell were primarily in Ohio, actually starting in Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, but Ohio. And then they all kind of quit building their big ceremonial places, right? And they all kind of migrated towards western New York, and around 300 or 400 AD, that was the end of them. And they built these rudimentary forts in western New York. And he gave us a list of the ones that were there. And they know they're Hopewell because of the Hopewell artifacts they find in them. And they all date to this 300 or 400 AD period. And so all this stuff combined made me realize that we've made a couple fundamental mistakes with the Book of Mormon. Number one was with the times and seasons, attributing that to Joseph Smith and giving it credibility. Number two was what Sorensen said about Joseph believing this hemispheric thing. That was all based on those Mesoamerican articles. Because you can't find anything where Joseph Smith ever endorsed that. In fact, I once found in a journal, I don't know if I've published this, but I found in a journal in Nauvoo, a guy said, this was, I think, in 1841. A guy came into town, and he had this scroll, and it showed two brothers, I think it was two brothers, leaving Jerusalem and crossing over to Central America, something like that you would think would be a gold mine for the Meso guys, right? And he showed Joseph Smith, and Joseph Smith didn't have anything to do with it. And that's in a journal I have. I have the reference if people are interested. And that told me that Joseph knew that it had nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. Just like his change to Orson Pratt, where he said the Indians are the remnant of the Indians that live in this country, as opposed to all the other Amerindians in Central and South America. So the last one that people bring up is the landing in Chile. And it was Frederick G. Williams' handwriting. He said Lehi landed at the 30th parallel in Chile. And that's
the
always,
South American guys love.
Yeah, they love that. They rely on that. People in Chile are all taught that from childhood, and it's unbelievably awful when they find out it's not true. And so, but I started thinking, why would Frederick G. Williams think that? And it dawned on me, well, maybe he heard the 30th parallel. Maybe Joseph made some comment about the 30th parallel. So he assumed it was south, and he looked on the map and saw it was Chile, so he said, well, he landed in Chile. But if you look at the 30th parallel north, it's right in Florida. It's the same parallel as Jerusalem. 30th parallel, right, between 1 or 2 degrees.
Baja.
And Baja's fine. Like I say, Baja's awesome. And so I just don't think there's any archaeology to support Baja at all. But, they have an explanation for that, and that's great. Like I say, as long as, if you reject the New York Cumorah, then anything's on the table. I'm fine with any of it. I'm fine with the fantasy maps at BYU and CES. They teach all these kids using these fantasy maps that aren't even real world places. It's like out of Lord of the Rings or something. And that's what they're teaching all the kids. So it's no wonder the kids don't believe it's a real history, But if you look at what the Book of Mormon actually says, what the prophets have always said, and what the extrinsic evidence in archaeology, anthropology, and so on, it all fits in the Heartland. And so I come back to this issue of why is the M2C citation cartel so adamant about suppressing Heartland? To the point where the Church History Department, they acknowledge that they omitted Cumorah from the Saints Volume 1. And why? Purely because of the interconnection between Church History Department and BYU scholars, where they're all convinced it's Mesoamerica. There's no other reason to omit the church history, documented church history, right in the Joseph Smith papers about the Hill Cumorah in New York. The only reason no one knows about that is because they don't want people to know about it, because it doesn't fit their Meso thing. So I come back to this with the idea that if you look at the Book of Mormon as an actual history, you have to find some place that fits. And to fit in Central America, they have to continually reinterpret it. Recently, the National Geographic did a big LIDAR project down there in Guatemala. They uncovered this massive, even bigger cities than they thought, millions of population.
Right.
So now all of a sudden, Book of Mormon Central is saying, well, we knew it was millions of people all along, It's hard to articulate their position with a straight face to me anymore because it's so ridiculous. As another example, early on, Sorensen said...
I can hear the critics being like, the critics love the Meso versus Heartland.
Yeah, I know they do.
Battles.
I know they do. But they have, even Sandra Tanner long ago published an article, Where is Cumorah? And she said, Joseph and Oliver said it was in New York. All the church history says it was in New York. Every prophet who ever has talked about it says it's in New York, including in General Conference. President Romney in General Conference, Marquis Peterson, others. It's talked about it specifically, Cumorah's in New York, right? And yet, we're supposed to believe that all the prophets were wrong because of these guys' interpretation of the Book of Mormon. I mean, it's just the tail wagging the dog. It's ridiculous. So, but I can understand their thinking because of the way they interpreted the Book of Mormon to require millions of people and all this. But when you look at the actual numbers that are described in the Book of Mormon, it's a fairly small population. And that's consistent with all the archaeology. It was, if you look at the river systems along the Ohio River and the Mississippi River, they were all living along the river because that's where they would fish and travel and trade and all that stuff. So you don't have hundreds of millions or even tens of millions of Nephites anywhere. It's not in the Book of Mormon and not in the archaeology. But that's what you do have in Mesoamerica. And that's why they're trying to just like they're trying to find volcanoes in the text, they're trying to find millions of people, and it just isn't there. I mean, even when Alma came down to Zarahemla, after he'd been, in bondage and all that, he came to Zarahemla, and they asked him to set up churches. How many did he set up? Do you remember? 7 churches. So 7 churches for millions of people? I don't think so.
Well, yeah, because I know you try to keep the numbers a lot smaller.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I'm not trying to keep them small. I'm just reading what it says. Mm-hmm. I'm not trying to... frankly, I am agnostic when it comes to interpretations of the Book of Mormon. I'm fine with Baha. I'm fine with anybody. I just want them to be explicit about what they're saying. And anyone who says Cumorah is not in New York is saying the prophets were wrong. There's no way around that. They can say, well, they were naive, or they were making an assumption, or they were speculating, or someone started this false tradition that they adopted. All those euphemisms have been employed by the Mesoamerican guys to justify what they believe. But the bottom line is, we can all read it for ourselves, and they're saying they were all wrong. And I think, okay, if you want to say that they were all wrong, that's fine, but you better have a really, really, really overwhelming reason why they were wrong. And here's another example. They say, well, Joseph and Oliver never claimed revelation for saying Hill Cumorah was in New York. And I think, well, they never claimed revelation for John the Baptist coming either. He just came, right? Peter, James, and John just came. It wasn't revelation that they came. They came. And it's the same with this room in the Hill Cumorah that they visited, right? Because Oliver Cowdery related this, and Brigham Young mentioned it. David Whitmer said Oliver told him about it, that they went in the repository of Nephite records in the Hill Cumorah, at least twice. We don't know how many times, but they went in there twice. And they knew where it was because they had been there. It's like, I don't need a revelation that you're in my living room because you're here, I see you, right? So I can say, it's a fact that we had this conversation today. I don't have to say, God revealed to me that we had a conversation. So for Oliver Cowdery to say, it's a fact that these battles took place here, and this is the Hill Cumorah of Mormon 6:6, he doesn't need a revelation of that because he experienced it. He went in the repository himself. He saw the other records. So those guys, the Meso guys all explain that, well, it was a vision, it was again, I have to be serious. They say it was a vision of a hill in Mesoamerica that Oliver and Joseph shared somehow, and they had it on multiple occasions. And I think, okay, you can believe that if you want, but why don't we tell everybody what the historical facts are and let people make up their own minds? And let's just not pretend this stuff never happened. Let's not decorrelate Cumorah because we don't like what the prophet said. Instead, why don't we look at the historical facts and see if there's an interpretation that's consistent with what the prophet said. I don't know, it really kind of blows me away that this is so obvious, and yet I still keep hearing these stupid arguments about snow. I mean, come on. I don't know.
I hope you enjoyed our conversation with Jonathan Neville, a Heartland expert. In our next conversation, we're going to tackle the DNA issue. Most Native Americans seem to trace their DNA from Asia. How does Jonathan explain this?
So my interpretation of it is the Jaredites had Asian DNA, they brought over during their travels, and they spread throughout the Americas.
If you'd like to hear the entire interview uncut, please subscribe to patreon.com/gospeltangents for just $5 a month. Patreon is spelled patreon.com/gospeltangents. If you'd like to watch the entire video, you can subscribe at YouTube, Patreon, or on my website at gospeltangents.com and click the yellow subscribe button for just $8 a month. PDF transcripts are just $10 a month, and you can get those on patreon.com/gospeltangents or on my website. I'll send those to you as soon as I've finished completing it. If you'd like to get a paperback and PDF, just subscribe for $20 a month at either Patreon or on my website. Individual paperbacks are available at Amazon.com. Just do a search for Gospel Tangents Interview, and you can find all of our past interviews there. Show your Gospel Tangents pride by purchasing a t-shirt on our website at gospeltangents.com/shop. Subscribe on Apple Podcasts at tinyurl.com/gospeltangents. You can get our latest updates by friending me at Facebook, or you can also follow our page at facebook.com/gospeltangents. Become an insider and you can see the newest videos. Follow us on Twitter at gospeltangents. Click here to subscribe, here for a transcript, and over here we've got some of our great videos. Thanks again.